Hi, welcome Yafit to my podcast. Thanks for taking this time out to come and talk with me, because I know how horrible the situation has been at your end, and we've been scheduling this for quite a few days, like a couple of days now. This was supposed to be a podcast about how Israel came out of its COVID situation, and while we were like scheduling the interview, this whole horrible thing started with Israel and Palestine, and so now we are talking about this very subject. Uh, so welcome to the show, and let's start with the bigger question at the hand. What is exactly happening in Israel right now?
Right. So first of all, thanks for having me. And it is amazing this past week when we, first decided to talk about, we thought we'd talk about COVID, and things go so very quickly. Even yesterday, we had the Fest of Shavuot, which is a big Jewish holiday, and we had this dinner at my brother's. And he said it almost seems like Israel is like on a different dimension than the rest of the world. Everybody's still having to cope with COVID and have all these things they have to, they still haven't, been able to completely deal with COVID. People are still being vaccinated. In Israel, that sounds like, a long time ago, right? When we had COVID, nobody's talking about it anymore. We have even started forgetting our face masks.
Oh.
I mean, and so this past week has really, felt that way because so much has happened. Over the past week, we had 3,000 rockets launched at Israel, quite a few airstrikes over Gaza, lots of people killed on both sides, and a very stressful time for everybody. So it's hard to even, pin down and say, where this all started, really. I can say that, as most people know, Ramadan ended not very long, like a week ago. It was a very tense time. Everybody knew it. There was some provocation from the Israeli right-wing extremist, somebody called Ben-Gvir, who's now a member of Knesset, who ended up in the Knesset because Netanyahu advocated for it. Just when he had in mind his future coalition, he knew he needed those seats. So he did everything in his power to bring him in. But then when everything was so tense with Ramadan, there was this legal court proceedings going for years of the eviction of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in eastern Jerusalem. And that ended up in Israel's Supreme Court just a week ago. And the very preliminary court ruling seemed to go in favor of the settlers, the Israeli Jewish settlers, who tried to evict those families. And that caused a lot of frustration and anger on the Palestinian side of these families, in the Arab world, and also in the left side of the Israeli politics and society, because many people realized there was this sort of way to use Israeli law in order to sort of take control of other parts of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, as many people know, has been divided for many, many years. Only just a few days ago, Israel celebrated Jerusalem Day, which is the day that sort of symbolizes the day that Jerusalem was reunified.
Yeah.
And that was back in 1967 when there was a 6-day war in Israel, and Israel took control over the eastern side of Jerusalem. So this was a very tense time for everybody. And if that wasn't enough, you had these two sides. Hamas wanted, there was supposed to be an election both in the West Bank and Gaza.
Gaza, yeah.
Exactly. And Hamas, well, according to all signs, was in the lead. So you've got Hamas controlling Gaza, Fatah is controlling the West Bank, and for many years, somewhat because of Israel, but not just, Fatah has been losing its control, and has been sidetracked in many ways. Israel has not been collaborating with them enough, and that made Hamas gain more and more power. I mean, this is obviously very, very simplified, but they did know that they were probably going to win this election, and that is the reason why Mahmoud Abbas, who's the head of Fatah, decided to postpone the election. And Hamas was frustrated by that, angered by that, and they realized they were losing grip of what they expected to. They expected to gain more control. And then on the other side, it was the Israeli election, the fourth in 2 years. Netanyahu has still not been able to form a coalition. In Israel, you've got 120 seats. You need 61 in order to have a majority and have some way to pass laws and to actually control the parliament, the Israeli Knesset, as we called it. And that's the reason why on both sides there was all this pressure. I mean, Netanyahu knew that every time he was in sort of political danger, it's been happening a few times in the past when he decided to, he was more in favor than ever in these kind of attacks, because that sort of rallied everybody, especially on the right side of the map, but not just. Everybody behind him. Everybody knows that a war is a time when everybody sort of supports their leader and their army. And in many ways, it was also a very peculiar time in Israeli politics, because just before the last round of election, Netanyahu was sort of flirting.
He was supposed to lose the election. Like, that was the word around the world, maybe.
Yes, so he knew he had to change something, right? And one of the main things he tried to do, because he is very clever, right? In Israel, everybody calls him the magician, because he always knows what to pull off. What's the next rabbit he'd pull out of the hat in order to gain control and to stay in power. And he has been doing so for well over a decade. And he was, just before the last round, he was flirting with an Arab Israeli party. And that was, they are right-wing, traditional Muslim party. And he knew that if he'll be able to get them on his side, he'll probably be able to form a coalition. A very strange coalition, because on the one hand, you'll have somebody like Ben Gvir, I mentioned before, who's a right-wing Jewish extremist. And then on the other hand, you'd have somebody who is very much of a Muslim, right-wing Muslim, who in many ways people would not even believe those two sides would ever be able to sit together. But they do have a few things a few points on their agenda are quite similar, you would say, especially the religious side, being able to provide that kind of freedom of religion in Israel. They had a few things that they did agree on, and they thought that could very well happen. However, it proved to be very tricky, not because of Ben Gvir, but because of a different member of that supposed coalition. And then he wasn't able to form that coalition. And once he wasn't able to, then the other side realized they could do that. I mean, for many, many years, it was almost
Yair Lapid, right? He's the leader of the other side, the centrist party.
Exactly. So the second largest party in Israel is Yair Lapid's party. Then you had a few others who are center-right parties. Israel has many parties. That's one of the main problems, and one of the biggest struggles and challenges any coalition would have is having to sort of put bring all these different
do a
parties
common
together.
program. Yeah. Come up with a common
Exactly.
program. Yeah.
But for many, many years, any other, sort of rival of Netanyahu would struggle because they would always say, okay, I can't really form a coalition with an Arab party. That was just not, because, well, most people wouldn't, see that as an option. Because they would always say they align with the Palestinian point of view, and they would always support a Palestinian state, and that's not something we, as the right wingers, would agree to. But then, because Netanyahu suddenly did that, it made it suddenly something that everybody else would consider, and that
it's like if he can do it, then we can definitely do it, right?
He legitimized this party that before was never considered as a party that any Zionist party, Jewish Zionist party, would consider as a
an
partner.
ally. Yeah.
Exactly. So that was a game changer in many ways. But then everything was provoked. Then suddenly we ended up in this situation. I mean, this is sort of a very funny time where some Israelis would say this sounds like something Netanyahu would pull off, because he realized he wouldn't be able to form a coalition. On the other hand, he legitimized a party that could very well go with a different, set of players. And because of that, because of these very strong anti-Palestinian sentiment at the moment, in this war we're having, then one of the main key players, not Lapid, but his name is Naftali Bennett. He's head of Yamina, which is a right-wing party, mostly representing settlers. So you would think these are people who would never sit with, an Arab party. They haven't. I mean, it makes no sense, right? But because Netanyahu said it, like legitimized it, they considered it. They really considered it. But then once the war started, Bennett announced that he wasn't able to go and form a coalition with them. And then
so the war has taken away the legitimacy away from the whole situation. Now it's hard for anybody to sort of get on board with Arab-Israeli parties.
Exactly. And part of the reason for it is also because Hamas was able to rally a lot of the Israeli Arabs. So for people who don't know, Israel has about 9 million citizens. About 2 million of them are Muslims.
But that's almost more than 20% of your population.
And most of them are Palestinians. So once you have these kind of crises, some sort of conflict with the West, with the Palestinians, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank, the Israeli Arabs find themselves in a very tricky situation. On the one hand, they're residents of Israel, and in some way, obviously this is their home. They wouldn't want ever to, leave their home. On the other hand, we're talking about their brothers and sisters. Sometimes they're literally their families over there in the West Bank or in Gaza. And it's very hard. It puts them in a very
tough
very
situation. Very tough spot maybe.
Exactly. And Hamas knows that. Hamas knows that, and he has been able to rally quite a lot of the Arab Israeli community because of the. I don't know if you've seen those images coming out of the Temple Mount right after Ramadan, and the Israeli forces breaking in to try to calm everybody down, because those Muslims who were praying, they were also throwing all sorts of rocks down at the western wall, and there was all this tension there, and all the images that came out, like the footages coming out of the Temple Mount, sort of rallied Israeli Arabs who said, wait a second, Jerusalem is for us as well. The Temple Mount belongs to the Muslim community. You cannot do something like that. And he's been able to, Hamas has been very successful at rallying.
To persuade Arab Israelis thinking that this is how they treat us, like you're still the second-class citizens.
Exactly.
But isn't it like it's always been both these sides have been doing something like, okay, we won't talk about a larger issue like since 1917 when the declaration was done by the British government. I think let's just focus in the last 6 months. A Palestinian teenager posts a video that he attacks a Jewish old man on TikTok. and then repetitive attacks happen at the same time all over maybe Israel. At the same time, Sheikh Jarrah case happens. After that, because of the COVID restrictions, some rules are imposed on gathering together near the Temple Mount for everybody. Then they are relaxed later on. But as you said, some of the Israeli right-wing hyper-nationalists take a rally out on the Jerusalem Day when the Muslims are praying at the Temple Mount at the time of Ramadan. Everybody was playing their small bits and parts into creating this bigger conflict. And as my understanding from your answer to my first question is that Hamas and Netanyahu stand to gain a lot politically with this conflict, because in West Bank, whenever the election comes up, Hamas will the Fatah party will be on the back foot, because Hamas is trying to protect the Palestinians in Israel at the moment. And obviously, because of the war, whenever there is a war, the country goes towards a stronger leader. So Netanyahu will be able to, whenever this conflict goes away, will be able to secure another majority in the government. So it's a very complicated situation. Don't you think like that, maybe?
Of course. Well, I always say that the Israeli and Palestinian conflict is a very complicated situation.
Yeah.
Also, it's very hard when I see people. I mean, I'm able to hear from all. I mean, I've lived in Europe for so many years. Some of my best friends are in Europe, and I see all these footages from like rallies against Israel with some very strong words against Israel. And then on the other hand, I'm seeing some Israelis saying the most horrible things about even Israeli Arabs. I'm not even talking about Palestinians. I mean, this is a very difficult time when you see all of that. And I keep saying to everybody around, stop simplifying everything, because there's no bad guy and good guy in this story. It's all very complicated. There are lots of people who are actually losing out from this. And as you mentioned, politically, we're talking about very strong leaders, right? I mean, you've got some key leaders in Gaza. Hamas is definitely trying and sort of capitalizing what is happening now, because their end goal is to rally the West Bank. I mean, Palestinians on the West Bank, let's not forget, these are two distinctly geographic areas. I mean, they're not connected. Israel is right there in the middle. And the best way for Hamas to rally them is through these political sort of inflammable situations, when you know that these, I mean, what Muslim would not rally behind them when they sound like they're protecting, when they position themselves as the protectors of the Temple Mount. And this is exactly what they did, because it all started, people forget, the rockets, the very first rockets that were launched at Israel were in the launch. I mean, I will correct myself. There are always rockets launched at southern cities of Israel, right next to Gaza. People don't remember that these are, I mean, internationally known as Israeli lands, because they were part of the Israeli lands not back in 1967, the Green Line. Still, these are people who are under attack every year, every month on a yearly basis for a long time. And people forget that. I mean, sometimes Israelis forget that, which is, I think, the most tragic part. But nobody is ever talking about it, about these sort of conflicts, because they're local, and people see that as sort of a spillage. But it's not. It's a terrible situation down south, and that's a different story. But when it comes to this conflict, where it all started, it started from those two first rockets Hamas launched at Jerusalem. And that's so unusual. They almost never do that, mostly because, let's not forget, there are so many Palestinians living and could very well be harmed by these kind of attacks.
Absolutely.
But then it's also the holy city for everybody. I mean, they just don't do that. But they did that for one particular reason, because it was their way to show that they're protecting Jerusalem. They told Israel, if you're not going to back off the Temple Mount until, I don't remember, I think it was 6 o'clock, but they gave a specific time, a sort of an ultimatum, that unless they actually take the forces down and off that mountain, they will launch those rockets, and they did.
They did. I mean,
and they did.
Yeah.
It surprised everybody. It was very unusual. I know some members of my partner's family live in Jerusalem, and they were completely shocked. I mean, they never thought that could ever happen.
Yeah.
But it was their way to symbolize that they are fighting for Jerusalem. They're fighting for the Temple Mount against Israel. And it was a very strategic move on their end. And to be honest, when you look at the ground right now, I mean, the coverage, the media coverage around the world is focusing on what is happening in Gaza and in Israel in general, which makes complete sense. However, there is one part of the story that is not getting enough attention, which is all the riots taking place across Israel. So we were talking about the Arab Israelis who live here, and we're talking about 2 million citizens, some of them living, in mixed cities and mixed neighborhoods. I mean, Israel is very funny in a way that, there are certain cities that are primarily Jewish, and there are other cities that are primarily Muslim or Arab, because we do have Christians and other minorities. But there are other cities like Haifa, like Jerusalem, and we have even here in the center, I mean, part of Tel Aviv, the southern part of Tel Aviv is called Jaffa, and it's primarily Arab, but with Jewish neighborhoods in it. You have other cities like Lod and Ramleh, which were in the news almost every day because they had these strong riots happening, like very violent riots, where you saw Jews and Arabs just clashing on the street. So we're talking about neighbors who used to live like together in the same building or in the same neighborhood, going out to the streets, throwing rocks at each other. It's become very, very scary.
It's very terrible, right?
It is terrible, and it has happened in the past to some degree, in a sense that back in 2000, when the peace negotiations between Barak and Yassir Arafat broke down, when they hit that deadlock, the second, we call it a second uprising, took place, the second intifada in Arabic, and we had these clashes. However, this time, one of the biggest concerns is, first of all, the degree in which, I mean, you saw that expanding across many cities in the neighborhoods. I mean, in certain neighborhoods where people used to live side by side in peace. And then you will see also weapons being used sometimes. And then another, layer of it is that you would see for the first time, I would say I'm in my 30s. I've never seen in my life a situation in which Jewish mobs go out to the streets and start throwing rocks and hitting back at Arabs. I mean, you'd see those clashes. I mean, and you would see them also transport from different cities. So you would, you'd hear like the mayor of Lod, which is not very far from Israel's Ben Gurion International Airport. So it's very central. He said people came all the way from up north in those buses, both from Arab cities, but also from Jewish cities, just to fight in his city, which is bizarre and scary and dangerous.
So basically, you're spiraling into civil disruption right now. The instigation is just growing rapidly, and
exactly.
But how is the state of Israel trying to curb these riots right
now? So the police has been struggling for a few weeks. For a few days. It does feel like weeks, to be honest, because this past week feels like a month. But for the first few days, they struggled. They did get some backing from there is some sort of unit in the Israeli army which actually belongs to the police, because the Israeli army can't arrest Israeli citizens. It's not part of their jurisdiction, so only the policeman can do that. So they've been able to support them to some degree. And also they've been recruiting more police officers.
So they are
Help.
not understaffed, but they don't have enough manpower at the moment too.
I think they just didn't see it coming either. I mean, this did take them by surprise. So I think it was also about mobilizing. I mean, Israel is very small. It's not like India is. It's tiny. But then you would still need to know where to put your your troops.
Yeah.
And in this case, where to put your police officers.
Yeah.
It's been a very very difficult week for all forces, both the Israeli army and the police. But I would say that there is quite lots of Israelis are disappointed with the police at the moment. They do see it as this body that is not really being able to calm things down very quickly.
Yeah.
I will say, however, that over the past few days it's been calmer, but I wouldn't put my money on, I'm not very sure that this is the last that we're going to see of this civil unrest, and especially because there is, the conflict with Gaza is still ongoing, and we just don't know what is going to happen when it comes to the Israeli coalition. What will be their next steps? This is a very tricky time with lots of challenges. I was very glad to see a lot of Jewish and Arab Israelis coming together over the last few days, holding a lot of demonstrations in support of a Jewish and Arab collaboration. Exactly.
That is most important. I was just coming to that question right now, because all we've been hearing is this fighting going on between Israel and Palestine, and it has also divided the world. I mean, that's what I put up the Instagram story, that don't pick sides yet. It's a very complicated issue, and I'm sure, I had a hunch. I didn't know I didn't have any empirical evidence, but I had a hunch that maybe the citizens don't want this. Maybe the citizens just want to peacefully coexist, get on with their work every single day, come back to their families, and live a happy life. And that's what most of the citizens want, and it's very a fraction of part of a society which wants war and everything. So can you tell me about these peaceful demonstrations these are happening right now?
Well, we did see over the last few days some big demonstrations across the country in different locations. Again, we're talking about Israeli Arabs. We're not talking about Palestinians, because we live in different places, right?
Yeah.
So that's the sad part. I mean, you wouldn't see like Palestinians and Israelis standing shoulder to shoulder. I wish we could see that. I think that could have helped everybody. But it was very important to start seeing that. I also know that on Twitter there is this everybody is adding this purple dot to their names on Twitter to support this Israel Jewish and Arab collaboration and partnership. Yeah, exactly. It's very interesting, because you'd see this kind of collaboration coming from all sides. So you would see those organizations that usually work toward peace, but then you'll see, for example, some women's organizations coming out and saying, we need to help our the men in our lives, whether it is our brothers or husbands or friends. Because you will see, and this is the most interesting thing, I mean, when you see all these mobs from both sides, whether Arab or Jewish, we're talking about men, mostly men. You don't see any woman on the street. And that's another, I mean, the women's organizations have used that as a way to say, we have a responsibility to calm everybody down. We're going to live side by side. They're our neighbors. There's no other place we can live. Let's work together. So it's very encouraging, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm no expert in this domain, but I think peaceful coexistence is the only answer for humanity anywhere on the face of this planet. I mean, I come from India. We have similar conflicts with Pakistan. I guess it's quite well known. But whenever I have a lot of Pakistani friends myself, and whenever I talk to them, or whenever I come across in general Pakistani, a sentiment, it's the citizens don't really care about this. It's like it's okay. It happened in the past. I mean, let's just go ahead and it, accept the status quo and start moving ahead. And I think the same kind of thing happened in 1993 with the Oslo Accord, when Yassir Arafat said that, you know what, we acknowledged Israel's right of existence. You had a few conflicts after that as well, but I wanted to like, but still, what we should have expected as a world, that it goes to a better place from 1993. But today here we are standing, and there are 5,000 rockets armed with Hamas at the moment, 8,000 more in their arsenal with their other militant group, and they're ready to fire at Israel. How did we come from that to this?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think it's the 1 million question, right? I mean, it's very hard to say because it is a very complicated situation.
Yeah.
I agree with you completely in the sense that, I mean, as a civilian, I definitely feel that most of the problems have a political background. And in many ways, I feel that it serves people. And I started by saying, you know, Hamas has a reason to do this right now. I mean, this conflict serves Hamas.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I mean, this is very controversial in Israel to say, but I do believe that Netanyahu has something to gain from this conflict. It's not to say that he has, you know, really pushed for it, or that he provoked it.
Yeah.
But I also feel that he could have done more to prevent it. Yeah. And it says enough in my eyes. And I think that in many ways, the people who suffer at the end are the civilians here and the civilians obviously in Gaza. It's a very difficult time. But I would say that in my eyes, I mean, the way that I think it boils down to what you just said. I mean, when you meet your friends from Pakistan, usually, you know, you'll have, you know, this normal conversation, and you'll even forget there is a conflict. And I had the same kind of conversations with Palestinians. But the thing is, and I don't know about you, but for me, it was funny because the only time I had a conversation with someone from, you know, the West Bank or from Gaza wasn't in Israel; it was in Europe.
I'm sorry, it was the same thing for me. It was in Europe, not in India. Yeah. Sorry.
And I feel that in many ways that is part of the issue. I mean, again, this is my personal opinion, obviously, but the way that I see it, I mean, we both work in a world of communication, and I do believe that communication is key in order to bridge any gaps and to sometimes overcome these sort of difficulties. The problem is that at the end of the day, we don't really talk to each other. Israelis don't really have Palestinian friends. They don't talk to them. They don't see them. They're very far away from from us. And I think it's the same over there. I mean, some of them have never met an Israeli. And it's very easy to demonize and to sort of turn somebody into an enemy when you don't really know them. I mean,
absolutely. And it's easy to do it when you control the media, right? I'm sure Hamas controls media in Gaza. Fatah controls media in Palestine. It's the same thing. Like, you must have heard the example, like the Dalai Lama is actually a demon in China, which is very funny to even comprehend that. So when you have control over media, you can just instigate people like that, maybe.
I agree. I think it's the control of the media is very much a part of it. I think in Israel it's more complex because Israeli media is free and it's privately owned. Most of it is. I mean, there's only one state-owned channel in Israel, a few radio stations, but still the vast majority of the media in Israel is privately owned. And even if there is some level of censorship, it's still not, I mean, it's quite westernized. But I think that to some degree there is still, I mean, one of the things many people pointed out on Twitter mostly is that we don't really see on the television many footages of what is happening in Gaza. I mean, you don't really see so many casualties or those horrible images of the wreckage in Gaza. I have seen it on the BBC and I've seen it on foreign media. But in Israeli media, you don't see much of it. It's not to say that you can't see at all. Of course, there is, you will find some of it, but it's still quite limited. And I think the fact that we don't see that, it's easier to forget. It's easier to forget that civilians are hurt, even if, and I do, I will say again, this is controversial. Some of my left wing, especially non-Israeli friends, would, disagree with me. I don't think that the Israeli army, is aiming at civilians in Gaza. I don't think that they don't care about that, mostly because most of the people in my family were part of the Israeli army. I know people in the Israeli army at the moment. These are not people that, will celebrate hitting a family or, innocent civilians. Exactly. So I don't agree with that. I will say, however, that the fact that we don't see it is easier for the Israeli, the Israeli population to back this war. For example, right now, there are so many people who say, don't stop. I mean, they need to pay for what they've done. We need to make sure they won't be able to do it anytime soon again, because we're under attack. We need to protect ourselves. But there is no balance, in a way that you don't really see footages of those people who are there and are getting hurt, even if we don't mean it, even if we don't, really want it. It's still, or even if we're really trying to, and I'm sure that we're trying to avoid it by any means, at the end of the day, some people are victims of this conflict on their side as well. And it's easier to support this, to continue, when you don't really see the results. And I think in some way, and I'm sure that in Gaza, I mean, I don't want to say it because I'm not sitting there in Gaza, but I will be very much surprised if somebody tells me that they actually show Israeli families who were killed here, or civilians here who were killed by their rockets. I doubt it. And I think that is one of the problems. I mean, if you don't know anyone, like in person, if you don't see footages and the hurt of the other side, it's just easier to continue and back this kind of conflict.
I think what we just talked about, a lot of things were going on in my head, and all this political propaganda was playing, because I'm a student of political communication. So justifying war, how to justify war, everything was like an academic subject for me. But so I know how you can actually tell your, like any country can tell its citizen that we are doing it for us, it's for us and everything. But I think in this is where the foreign media should play a better role. Like, I guess it's more about that than just to inform news at the moment. I think instead of picking sides, which few of the foreign media outlets are doing at this very moment, they should sensitize the citizens on both the sides. Like, it's harming both of you. You need to understand this. Like, at least in the international community, maybe even in Israel or Palestine, where they can broadcast their message, like what you said, they need to show this both sides to both the citizens. That's the only way they can be helpful in this conflict at the moment. Otherwise, it's again going to be the same international politics. People will pick sides, then it will go to international courts, then the United Nations will intervene, and the chain goes on again and again. It's never going to stop. So you're absolutely right. I mean, both the governments need to. We are not here to advise the government, but it's really sad to see what's happening at the moment. I mean, it really breaks my heart, and I hope the situation is resolved soon, and foreign media plays a better part again.
I agree. I do think that in many ways, I mean, Israelis many are well read, many are on social media and read English quite well. I think they do read foreign media, but then at the end of the day, many of them will say they don't know what it's like. And also many Israelis are really very much hurt by the fact that some of the media are taking the Palestinian side, are very pro-Palestinian, and that makes Israelis feel like they're victimized in a way. I mean, some Israelis would be, I mean, they wouldn't even bother reading the BBC, or they wouldn't even bother reading, the New York Times. And they will always say, whatever we do, they'll always, make us the, the
villains or
oppressors,
the
and they're always
the negative
exactly.
this thing, antagonists.
And in many ways, there is exactly. In many ways, it makes Israelis, turn to Israeli media because they'll feel okay. They understand us. They show what's there to see. And in some ways, that's. I think I agree with you. I think the foreign media don't really understand how big of a role they can play if they were a bit more balanced. I don't think they're actually helping, and in many ways, it's quite the contrary.
Yeah.
I mean, if Israelis always feel they're under attack by international media, they always feel like they need to justify themselves instead of actually taking a moment to actually realize what is happening in Gaza and to find a solution or a creative solution. I mean, I think it's really funny. I mean, the tragedy of it is Israel is probably one of the most fantastic places in the world for technological advances and for finding a solution for nearly any problem. I mean, that's the Israeli state of mind, right? I mean even the Iron Dome is a perfect example of Israeli ingenuity and trying to figure out how to solve a problem we can't really control. And it's really sad that it doesn't really extend to the political side of things and to actually fixing this problem. But again, I feel that if there will be enough people interested in actually making it work, and when I mean people, I actually do mean the political leaders on both ends, I think that will resolve faster than people think. The problem is that right now, civilians on both sides are under attack and for no apparent reason in terms of, the future of everybody here. Everybody's staying, everybody's going to live here. We'll have to find a way to live together. And these kind of conflicts and wars, they're not going to resolve anything.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been in conflict with our neighboring state, Pakistan, for the last 70 years. And the state that has been a part of this conflict, Kashmir, it is so economically backward. And, people over there suffer a lot. They don't have a lot of means to earn their living. It's kind of like Switzerland. It's really beautiful. It can become like the tourist capital of the South Asia. But the conflict has killed all the potential for the society and the people over there. And that has actually taught me that if you get into a conflict, a geographic, any kind of conflict with a neighboring state, it's going to destroy the next 30 years of that particular region. And if you just try to find a peaceful solution, maybe it will take 5 to 10 years, but something good may come out of it. You never know. So, and killing people at any point of time is not acceptable as humans to anyone in the world. And I hope things get better over there. I'm like all of my friends over here are really worried about their friends in Israel. Some of the people that I know, their relatives are studying in Tel Aviv. So it's kind of a very close tied situation for us.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have some Indian friends, both who live in India and some living back in the UK. I'm always in touch with them. Some of them, just like you, remind me of your political situation and how there are some similarities between the countries. But as you said, the close relationship between India and Israel I mean, both on between people like us and also on a state level. Is fantastic. And the sad thing is, just before we entered this ridiculous conflict, Israelis were talking about how we should assist India in its war against COVID. After being able to make it actually work. I mean, the COVID campaign was fantastic here in Israel. And it's so sad that this has not been discussed ever since, and we've been thrown into this intense and scary week for everybody.
I think next time when we talk, we'll do an episode about how Israel beat COVID and this conflict at the same time. And
sounds good.
Yeah. And my best wishes with you, Yafit, and thank you for coming on the podcast. Thank you for sharing your insights into this situation, because a lot of technical discussions and talk shows had been done on this topic in the last few days, but it was really important for people in India and all across the world. They need to understand the political intricacies on both sides when they are getting into this conflict. And I'm sure all the audiences are clever enough to read between the lines, and maybe they'll find a better solution out of this. And thank you, Yafit. My best wishes to you, your family, your friends, and my prayers are with the people of Israel. And I hope that this conflict is resolved soon, and everybody from Palestine and Israel are safe and sound.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks
Thank you.
so much.